The moonlight filtered through the mouth of the shallow cave cold and silver, casting long shadows across the rough stone walls. The wind carried voices from below, harsh and eager, mingled with the crunch of boots on loose gravel. Ruth Larkin pressed her back against the rock, one hand clutching a dented tin mug, still warm from the coffee Chayton had brewed over the small fire, the other cradling the swell of her belly. 8 months. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing the fear that thrummed through her veins. Chayton moved without sound, his moccasins silent on the cave floor. He was tall, lean muscle wrapped in buckskin and beadwork that caught the firelight in brief flashes of blue and white. His hair hung loose past his shoulders, black as the night beyond the cave entrance. He spread a thick buffalo fur near the flames, smoothing it with one hand, then pulled back the wool blanket he'd been using as a windbreak against the draft. "Right here." He said, his voice calm, almost gentle, but with an underlying steel. He positioned himself between her and the entrance, settling into a crouch, with his Winchester rifle propped against his thigh, one hand resting on the stock. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. They'll see the smoke. They already have. He glanced back at her, his face half in shadow, half in firelight, unreadable. "Stay low. No matter what happens, you stay low." The voices grew louder, closer. "Search the rocks. She can't have gone far, not in her condition." A man's shout, thick with drink and malice, echoed off the canyon walls. Sparks crackled from the small fire orange against the encroaching darkness. Ruth set the mug down carefully, her hands trembling despite her effort to steady them. Footsteps crunched on the loose scree outside, slow and deliberate. One shadow fell across the firelight at the cave mouth, long and distorted, then another. Chayton's hand moved to the rifle, lifting it with practiced ease, his thumb sliding the hammer back with a soft click. Ruth pressed her palm flat against her belly, willing the baby to be still, willing her own heart to stop pounding so loud she was certain they could hear it from outside. The first shadow paused, and a voice called out, rough and triumphant, "I see a fire in there. Come out now, or we'll smoke you out like rats." Chayton raised the rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel. The firelight gleamed off the metal. Ruth held her breath. 2 days earlier, Ruth Larkin had arrived in Storm Creek, with everything she owned packed in a scarred trunk, strapped to the back of a borrowed mule. The town squatted between the Badlands and a line of cottonwoods that marked the creek, a collection of weathered buildings held together by dust, desperation, and the fading promise of gold. The sun beat down without mercy, though it was late October, and winter's cold breath was already stirring in the high country. She was 25 years old, a widow and 8 months pregnant. Her husband Finn had been a freighter, a man with a ready smile, restless hands, and dreams bigger than his sense. He'd died 3 weeks ago in what the territorial marshal in Grey Wolf had called a river accident. His body had been found at Tallow Creek Bend drowned, and they said though Finn could swim better than most men, and the water had been running low that time of year. Ruth didn't believe it. She'd buried him in Grey Wolf with the last of their money and used what little credit she could scrape together to reach Storm Creek, where Finn had promised her there'd be work, a future, a place to raise their child. The mule plodded down the main street past the saloon with its broken window, the general store with its faded sign, and the livery stable that smelled of horse and hay and old leather. Men stopped to stare, their eyes moving from her face to her belly and back again. Women turned away, clutching their shawls tighter. Ruth kept her chin up, though her back ached like fire and her feet were swollen in her worn boots. She'd learned early that weakness invited cruelty, and she couldn't afford cruelty now. At the boarding house, a narrow 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch, she knocked. A woman opened the door, middle-aged with a sour mouth and suspicious eyes. Ruth asked about a room, keeping her voice steady. 20 cents a night. The woman said, her gaze lingering on Ruth's belly with undisguised distaste. Plus another 5 for meals. and you'll need to pay the water tax on top of that." "Water tax?" Ruth repeated, confused. "2 bits a bucket. Kensington Crow's orders. The creek's his now, or what's left of it, after his mine got done with it." The woman's lip curled. "You got money, or did you come here to beg?" Ruth had 40 cents. She showed it, counting the coins out carefully. The woman sniffed. "One night, then. No meals. And keep quiet. I don't need trouble." Inside, the room was barely large enough for a narrow cot and a rickety chair. The window overlooked an alley strewn with refuse. Ruth set her trunk down and sat on the cot, which sagged alarmingly under her weight. Her hands shook as she opened the trunk with the brass latches stiff. Inside were 2 dresses, both patched, a woolen shawl her mother had given her, a Bible with a cracked spine, and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling. Finn's ledger. She'd found it hidden in their wagon under a false board, the pages warped and stained with what looked like water and something darker. The columns were filled with numbers and dates she didn't fully understand. But one word appeared again and again, always beside sums of money, and the initials K.C. Mercury. A knock at the door made her jump. She rewrapped the ledger hastily and opened the door a crack. A man stood there, stocky, with a foreman's flat-brimmed hat and a leer that made her stomach turn. "Heard there was a new girl in town. You looking for work?" "I'm looking for honest work," Ruth said, her voice cold. He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "There's honest and there's smart. Crow's mine pays good wages for women who know how to be friendly with the men. Real friendly." He reached for the door, pushing against it. Ruth slammed it shut and threw the bolt. The man laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup, and walked away, his boots heavy on the stairs. She leaned against the door, breathing hard, her heart hammering. The baby kicked, and she pressed her hand over the spot, whispering, "It's all right. We'll be all right." She didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards outside her door made her tense her hand, moving to the small knife she kept tucked in her belt. In the morning, she went to the Mercantile, a cramped building that smelled of flour and lamp oil. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger as she entered. "I'm looking for work," Ruth said. "Anything honest? Laundry, cooking, mending?" The clerk shook his head before she finished. "Nobody's hiring, not with the water trouble." "Water trouble?" He glanced toward the door and then lowered his voice. "Crow's mine 2 miles upstream. He dammed the creek, diverted most of it to his sluices. Uses mercury to extract the gold from the ore. The runoff's poisoning everything downstream. People are getting sick. Livestock's dying. Even the Lakota hunting grounds to the north are fouled." He leaned closer. "If you're smart, you'll leave. Storm Creek's dying and Crow's bleeding it dry." Ruth thought of the ledger, of Finn's handwriting, of the word mercury. "What about the law?" The clerk laughed bitterly. "Sheriff Miles is on Crow's payroll, has been for years. Anyone who complains has a way of disappearing or turning up dead in the creek." He straightened, his voice rising to normal. "Sorry, ma'am. Can't help you." Ruth left the Mercantile with a sick, sinking feeling in her gut. She had no money left after paying for the room. No family. Nowhere to go. The baby would come in a few weeks, maybe less. She spent the afternoon behind the livery stable, sitting on her trunk, trying to think past the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. That was when the 2 drunks stumbled into the alley. They saw her and exchanged glances, their eyes lighting up with a cruel amusement. One of them, a squat man with a scarred cheek, grabbed her arm. "What's a lady doing out here all alone? Don't you know it's dangerous?" Ruth pulled free, standing. "Leave me be." The other drunk, taller and meaner looking, kicked her trunk. "Maybe she's got something worth trading in there. Ruth's hand moved to the knife at her belt. Touch that trunk again, and you'll regret it. They laughed, the sound ugly. The first drunk reached for her again, his fingers closing on her wrist. A shadow fell across the alley, and a voice said flat and cold as winter ice, "Enough." The drunks turned. A Lakota man stood at the mouth of the alley, tall and still, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife sheathed at his belt. He wore buckskin leggings and a dark wool shirt, and his hair was bound back with a strip of rawhide. His face was angular, hard-edged, his eyes dark and unreadable. He looked at the drunks the way a man might look at coyotes circling a campfire. "You got no business here, Redskin," the first drunk said, but his voice wavered. The man didn't move. "Leave." The second drunk spat in the dirt. "Or what, you gonna scalp us?" He laughed, but it sounded forced. A door opened behind the Lakota man. Trusty Tom the blacksmith stepped out with a pair of hot tongs in his hand and the metal glowing faintly red. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders with a gray beard and scars from old burns on his forearms. He nodded to the Lakota man. "Chayton, these boys bothering you again?" Chayton's gaze didn't leave the drunks. "They're leaving." Trusty Tom grinned without humor. "That's right, they are." He lifted the tongs. "Aren't you boys?" The drunks muttered and left, casting dark looks over their shoulders. Trusty Tom watched them go, then turned to Ruth. "You all right, ma'am?" Ruth nodded, though her heart was still racing. "Thank you." Trusty Tom studied her, taking in the trunk, the threadbare dress, the swell of her belly. "You new in town?" "Just arrived yesterday." "Well, Storm Creek's not the friendliest place these days." He glanced at Chayton, who was already turning to leave. "That's Chayton. Trades hides and beadwork mostly. Doesn't talk much, but he's good people. Kept those two from robbing me last week when they tried to make off with some tools." Ruth looked at the retreating figure. "Thank you," she called after him. Chayton paused, glanced back at her with an expression she couldn't read, then walked away without a word. By evening, Ruth had been turned away from 3 more places. The boarding house owner refused to let her stay another night unless she could pay in advance for a week, which she couldn't. A foreman from Crow's Mine cornered her outside the saloon as dusk fell, offering her a bunk in the workers' camp if she'd be nice to the boys. She refused and walked away quickly, her face burning with humiliation and anger. She ended up near the bridge that crossed the creek, sitting on an overturned crate, watching the water flow sluggish and dark. The smell hit her first, a chemical stench, sharp and bitter, that made her eyes water. A dead fish floated past, belly up, its scales dull. She thought of Finn, of the ledger hidden in her trunk, of the way he'd promised her a future, and left her with nothing but questions and a child on the way. That was when she saw them. 3 men with a wagon stopped at the bridge in the fading light. They unloaded a barrel, rolling it to the edge where the creek ran slow and shallow over a bed of smooth stones. One of them pried the lid off with a crowbar. Even from a distance, Ruth could see the liquid inside silver and viscous, catching the last of the daylight. Mercury. They tipped the barrel, grunting with the effort, and the mercury poured out in a thick stream, splashing into the water with an oily sheen. Ruth stood, her breath catching in her throat. One of the men looked up and saw her. He was gaunt with a scar that split his upper lip, and he wore a long duster that hung open to reveal a pistol on each hip. She'd heard his name whispered in town, Roland, though some called him Widowmaker. He said something to the others, his voice carrying across the water, and they dropped the barrel with a clang and started toward her. Ruth ran. Her belly made her clumsy, throwing off her balance, and her boots skidded on the loose gravel of the road. A shot rang out, the sound flat and vicious, and the bullet whined past her ear close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. She stumbled, caught herself on a fence post, kept running. The cottonwoods were close, their branches dark against the sky. Another shot closer. She heard boots pounding behind her, heavy and relentless. A horse appeared from the trees, moving fast and low. Chayton leaned down from the saddle, his hand extended. "Take it." His voice was urgent but controlled. Ruth grabbed his hand. He pulled her up behind him with startling strength, his muscles bunching under his shirt, and she wrapped her arms around his waist as the horse surged forward. More shots, the sound like firecrackers echoing off the rocks. Chayton guided the horse through the cottonwoods, ducking low branches, splashing through a shallow ford where the water sprayed up around them. Ruth pressed her face against his back, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. They rode for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. The landscape shifted from cottonwoods to broken rock, the badlands rising in jagged ridges against the darkening sky. Chayton slowed the horse to a walk, then a stop, and guided it up a narrow trail barely wide enough for the animal's body. The trail led to a cave set high in the rocks, its mouth hidden by an overhang. Inside it was dry and smelled of old smoke and leather and something else, sage perhaps, or sweetgrass. Chayton dismounted and helped her down, his hands careful on her waist. Ruth's legs trembled as her feet touched the ground. He led the horse deeper into the cave, where there was space enough for the animal to stand, then built a fire with practiced efficiency, striking sparks from a flint and steel, feeding the flames with dry twigs and a piece of pitch pine. Ruth sank onto a buffalo fur, spread near the fire, her body shaking with exhaustion and residual fear. "They saw me." "I know." Chayton crouched by the fire, his movements economical. "They'll come looking." "Why did you help me?" The question came out harsher than she intended. He glanced at her, the firelight catching in his dark eyes. "I saw what they were doing at the bridge. The mercury. It's in the water downstream, flowing north toward my people's hunting grounds. The deer are sick. The fish are dying. We've been watching crows mine for weeks, waiting for proof." Ruth opened her mouth and then closed it. Slowly, she reached into the bundle she'd been carrying tied to her belt and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. She held it out to him. Chayton took it, carefully unwrapping it, then turning the pages with a delicacy that surprised her. His jaw tightened as he read, the muscles working. "Your husband wrote this. He's dead." Ruth met his eyes. "They killed him. I think he found out about the mercury. I don't know if he tried to stop them or—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Chayton closed the ledger, his expression hard. "There's a federal land agent based in Grey Wolf. Gruner. If we can get this to him, it's proof. Crow won't be able to hide anymore. Grey Wolf is 3 days' ride from here, maybe more. 4 the way we'll have to go. They'll hunt us." He looked at her belly, his gaze assessing but not unkind. "Can you ride?" Ruth nodded, though fear twisted in her gut like a living thing. "Do I have a choice?" "No." He handed the ledger back, then spread another buffalo fur near the fire and pulled a wool blanket over it. "Rest now. We leave when the moon rises." Ruth lay down, the fur soft beneath her, the baby shifting and kicking inside her. Chayton sat by the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkness below. The fire crackled softly. For the first time since Finn had died, Ruth felt something other than crushing fear and loneliness. Not safety, not yet, but the faint, fragile possibility of it. She closed her eyes and against all odds slept. At dawn, the sound of horses woke her hooves on rock, voices calling back and forth. Chayton was already moving silent as a ghost, dousing the fire with handfuls of dirt. "Stay quiet," he said, not looking at her. Ruth pushed herself up, her back aching, and crawled to where she could see through a gap in the rocks. Below, riders were spreading out across the broken landscape, 10 or more of them, searching systematically. At their head was a big man with a tin badge pinned to his vest, Sheriff Crooked Miles, she'd heard him called, though no one said it to his face. His voice carried in the still morning air. "Search every hole and crack, they're up here somewhere, and I want them found before noon." Chayton crawled to the cave entrance, the Winchester in his hands. He sighted carefully down the barrel, taking his time, then fired. The shot cracked like thunder in the confined space, and below, one of the horses reared and threw its rider, who hit the ground hard and lay still. The posse scattered, men shouting, horses neighing in panic. Chayton worked the lever, ejecting the spent cartridge, and fired again. The bullet sparked off a rock near the sheriff's head, and Miles dove behind his horse for cover. "Get back deeper," Chayton said urgently. Ruth crawled backward, her heart pounding, the baby kicking hard as if protesting the noise. The posse regrouped, taking positions behind rocks, and began firing at the cave mouth. Bullets whined and ricocheted, chipping stone, filling the air with dust and the smell of gunpowder. Then she smelled smoke. The posse was piling brush at the cave mouth, dry branches and tumbleweeds. One of them struck a match. Flames licked up and smoke began to pour into the cave, thick and choking. Ruth coughed, her eyes burning, tears streaming down her face. Chayton fired twice more, driving the men back momentarily, but the smoke kept coming, filling the cave. "There's a way out." Chayton said, his voice tight with urgency. "Back of the cave. It's narrow. Can you manage?" "I'll have to," Ruth gasped. She followed him deeper into the cave, crawling on her hands and knees, her belly scraping against the rough stone floor. The passage narrowed until her shoulders barely fit the rock, pressing in on both sides. She could hear the posse shouting, hear the crackle of the fire growing louder. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down and kept crawling. The passage opened suddenly into a fissure that dropped almost vertically. Cold water seeped along the rock face, making it slick and treacherous. Chayton went first, bracing himself against the sides, sliding down in a controlled descent. He landed in water up to his waist and looked up at her. "Jump, I'll catch you." Ruth hesitated only a moment, then pushed off. The sensation of falling, even for just a second, was terrifying. Then Chayton's hands caught her arm, steadying her, and her feet hit the water. The cold was shocking, stealing her breath. The water came up to her chest, flowing fast, tugging at her heavy skirts. Chayton held her against the current, one hand firm on her back. "With me. Step carefully. The bottom's uneven." They waded downstream, Ruth's teeth chattering her legs, going numb with cold. Above them the shouts grew fainter, but didn't stop. Willows hung low over the creek, farther down their branches, trailing in the water, and Chayton pulled her beneath them, pressing close to the bank. They waited there, hidden in the green shadow, as the posse searched the rocks above. One rider came close, his horse picking its way along the bank, and Ruth held her breath, certain they'd be seen. But the rider moved on, and gradually the voices faded into the distance. When Chayton judged it safe, he helped her out of the water. They were a mile downstream from the cave, in a small hollow screened by willows and brush. Ruth was shaking violently, her lips blue. Chayton spread the wool blanket he'd carried tied to his belt, miraculously still mostly dry, and wrapped it around her shoulders, then pulled her close, sharing his body heat. They sat pressed together, his arm around her, until the worst of the shivering passed. "Thank you," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. Chayton didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. We need to keep moving. They'll figure out we went downstream. They walked through the afternoon, staying in the draws and gullies where the land would hide them. Chayton moved with an easy confidence that came from years of reading terrain, and Ruth tried to match his pace despite her exhaustion. By evening, they reached an old line shack, abandoned by some long-gone rancher, its roof partially collapsed, but the walls still standing. Chayton built a small fire, carefully screened from outside view, and they dried their clothes. As darkness fell, and they sat by the fire, Ruth looked at Chayton's profile, illuminated by the flickering flames. "You said your people's hunting grounds are being poisoned. How bad is it?" "Bad enough." His voice was flat, controlled. "The water runs slow through the marshes north of here. The mercury settles in the mud. The waterfowl that nest there are dying. The deer that drink there get sick. We've lost 2 children in the last year to fevers we've never seen before." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the anger banked behind his eyes. "Crow's killing more than just the land. He's killing my people, slowly. And no one with power seems to care." Ruth thought of the ledger of Finn's handwriting, of the columns of numbers that represented not just money, but lives. "We'll make them care," she said, and was surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. Chayton studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a shared purpose. Ruth felt it settle in her chest, solid and real. That night she woke to find Chayton sitting by the fire, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. She watched him for a while, this man who'd risked his life for her, a stranger, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the seed of it planted in the hard ground of survival and trust. They traveled at night for the next 2 days, moving through a landscape of broken rock and windswept plains. Chayton taught her as they went how to load cartridges quickly in the dark, feeling by touch, how to wrap her boots in burlap to muffle her footsteps, how to read the signs of water and shelter in the lay of the land. Ruth was a quick study driven by necessity and the knowledge that her life and her child's depended on these skills. The first major obstacle came on the 3rd night. They were crossing an abandoned rail spur, the tracks rusted and half-buried in drifting sand remnants of some failed mining venture. The land was flat and exposed, the moonlight bright enough to cast shadows. Chayton was leading, moving quickly but carefully, when Ruth heard it, a rattling rhythmic sound growing louder. "Run!" Chayton grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a culvert that ran beneath the tracks. They dove into it just as a handcar burst around the bend, pushed by 2 of Crow's men, their laughter harsh and drunk. The car's wheels screamed on the rails, sparks flying where metal met metal. It passed over them so close that Ruth could have reached up and touched the underside, the wind of its passage sucking at her clothes. Chayton covered her body with his weight, pressing her down into the dirt, his hand cradling her head. The car rattled away into the darkness, and they lay there for a long moment, breathing hard. When Chayton finally moved, helping her up, his hands lingered on her shoulders, and their eyes met in the darkness. Neither spoke, but Ruth felt her heart beating too fast for just the scare alone. The second escalation came in Bluebird Crossing, a town even smaller than Storm Creek, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. They approached cautiously at dawn, and Ruth's blood ran cold when she saw the posters nailed to every post and door. 40 gold for Lakota horse thief, armed and dangerous. The drawing was crude but recognizable. Chayton's face made to look savage and threatening. "You're not a thief," Ruth said, her voice shaking with anger. "Doesn't matter what I am. Matters what they can make people believe." Chayton studied the street, his expression unreadable. "We need supplies. Wait here." Ruth waited in the shadows behind the schoolhouse, her hand on the knife at her belt, while Chayton went to the general store. The minutes dragged like hours. Then she heard footsteps and turned, tensing. A woman stepped out from the schoolhouse door, young, perhaps 30, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and a schoolteacher's prim dress buttoned high at the neck. "You're with him, aren't you?" the woman said quietly. "The Lakota man on the posters." Ruth hesitated, calculating the risk. The woman smiled faintly. "I'm Adelaide Moore. I teach here, and I'm not turning you in." She glanced toward the main street. "Half this town hates Crow. His mind poisoned our wells 2 years ago, and the children keep getting sick. The other half's too scared of him to speak up." She pulled a bundle from under her shawl, bread wrapped in cloth-dried apples, a small jar of honey. "A federal agent with a U.S. Deputy Marshal Gruner is due in Grey Wolf in 3 days. If you can get there with your evidence, you might have a chance." Ruth took the bundle, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Thank you. We won't forget this." "Don't thank me yet. Just stop Crow." Adelaide glanced nervously toward the street. "Now go quickly before the deputy makes his rounds." Chayton appeared from the shadows, a small sack of cornmeal and coffee in his hands. They left Bluebird Crossing behind, moving fast through the scrubland. That evening brought the thunderstorm. They saw it building all afternoon, great towers of black cloud rising in the west, lightning flickering in their depths. By dusk, the wind was howling, carrying the smell of rain and electricity. Chayton led them to a creek crossing he knew, but when they arrived, Ruth's heart sank. The creek, normally shallow, had become a brown torrent, swollen with runoff from the storm upstream. A rope was strung across the water, anchored to cottonwood trees, on either bank, left by trappers perhaps, or miners. Chayton tested it, pulling hard, then waded into the current to gauge its strength. The water nearly swept his feet from under him, and he came back, his jaw set. "I'll go first. You hold on to me. Don't let go no matter what." He tied the rope around his waist first, then hers, knotting it securely. Ruth's hands were shaking as she gripped his belt from behind. They stepped into the water together. It was shockingly cold and strong, pulling at Ruth's heavy skirts immediately. Chayton moved carefully, testing each step, his body a barrier against the current. They were halfway across when the water deepened, suddenly rising to Ruth's chest, then her shoulders. Her feet lost contact with the bottom, and panic surged through her. A branch thick as a man's arm and traveling fast slammed into them. Ruth's grip on Chayton slipped. She went under the water, closing over her head, cold and suffocating, tumbling her. She couldn't tell which way was up. Her lungs burned. Then strong hands seized her, hauling her up. Chayton's arm was around her waist, crushing her against his chest, his other hand gripping a tree trunk that had lodged against a boulder in midstream. He held her there, his body taking the brunt of the current, his face close to hers. "I've got you," he said, his voice fierce. "I've got you. Breathe." Ruth gasped, coughing up water clinging to him. They stayed like that, pressed together against the tree, until the worst of the surge passed. Then Chayton pulled her across the rest of the way, step by agonizing step, until they reached the far bank and collapsed in the mud. Ruth lay on her back, the rain pouring down on her face, too exhausted to move. Chayton knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders, his face tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her whole body ached. "The baby?" He pressed his hand gently to her belly, his touch careful. After a moment, Ruth felt the baby kick hard, insistent, alive. Relief flooded through her so intensely that tears mixed with the rain on her face. Chayton met her eyes, and she saw her own relief mirrored there, along with something else, something deeper that neither of them had words for yet. "We keep moving," he said, but his voice was rough, unsteady. They found shelter in an old trapper's cabin a mile on the roof, half collapsed on one side, but the walls still solid. Chayton built a fire in the stone hearth, while Ruth changed into the one dry dress she had left in her bundle. She hung her wet clothes on a line he strung across the cabin's one room, and then collapsed onto a wooden bench near the fire, shaking with exhaustion and cold. Chayton moved around the small space, checking the corners, wedging the door shut with a piece of wood. When he came back to the fire, he sat beside her on the bench, and their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. The warmth of his body, the solid presence of him, was comforting in a way Ruth hadn't felt since Finn died, no. None, if she was honest, in a way she'd never really felt with Finn, and who'd always been restless, never quite there even when he was sitting beside her. "Why are you really doing this?" Ruth asked quietly. "You could take the ledger yourself. Travel faster alone. You don't need me." Chayton was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low. "I could, but I won't." "Why?" He turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Because when those men came for you at the bridge, you didn't just run. You ran toward the evidence, trying to see what they were doing. That takes courage." He paused. "And because you're carrying a child, that life matters. It deserves a chance." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something better, an acknowledgement of her worth, her strength, her right to survive. Ruth felt something crack open in her chest, a door she'd kept locked for a long time. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that went deeper than words. That night the storm raged outside, rain drumming on the cabin's broken roof, wind howling through gaps in the walls. Ruth woke sometime in the darkest hours to find Chayton sitting by the fire, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch as always. She watched him for a while, this man who'd become her protector, her partner in this desperate flight, and felt that seed in her chest begin to grow, sending out roots. Dawn broke clear and cold. They were preparing to leave when Chayton knelt by the far wall, his attention caught by something. He pulled aside a tarp that had been covering a pile of old gear and froze. Ruth came over and felt her heart stop. It was a saddle battered and worn, but unmistakable. Burned into the leather were the initials F.L. Finn Larkin. That's Finn's saddle," Ruth whispered. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch it, confirming it was real. Chayton was already searching it methodically, his face grim. He found Finn's pocket knife wedged into the cinch strap, the one with the staghorn handle Ruth had given him on their wedding day. Then a torn page from a ledger, folded small and tucked deep into the saddlebag. And beneath a loose floorboard nearby, disturbed recently, a spent .44 cartridge casing the brass dull with age. Ruth unfolded the ledger page with trembling hands. It was torn from Finn's book, showing a column of mercury weights and payments. But there was a note in Finn's handwriting at the bottom, one she'd never seen before. "Double payment secured, KC $200, a rail inspector $150. Final deal Tuesday." Her blood ran cold. He was selling it. To both of them. Before Chayton could respond, the door burst open with a crash. 3 men rushed in, Roland at the front, his scarred lip pulled back in a grin, his coat flaring to show the matched pistols. "Thought you'd hide in one of our cabins, did you? That's rich." Chayton moved with startling speed, grabbing the saddle and swinging it hard into Roland's face. Roland staggered back with a cry, blood streaming from his nose. The other 2 men drew their guns. Ruth grabbed Finn's knife from where Chayton had set it and threw it with all her strength. Her aim was poor, but the blade hit one man in the shoulder, making him yelp and drop his pistol, clutching at the wound. Chayton grappled with the 3rd man, and the 2 of them crashing against the wall, trading blows. Roland recovered, wiping blood from his face, and raised his gun, pointing it at Ruth. A rifle shot exploded in the small space. Roland jerked the gun flying from his hand and whirled to face the door. Trusty Tom stood there, a smoking rifle in his hands, his face hard as iron. Drop it, Roland. All of you drop your weapons now. The wounded man stumbled toward the door, cradling his shoulder, and ran. Chayton twisted his opponent's arm until the man screamed and released his gun, then shoved him toward the door. The man fled. Roland, outnumbered, bleeding, and now disarmed, raised his hands slowly. Chayton used the rope from the saddle to bind Roland's wrists, pulling the knots tight. Trusty Tom kept his rifle trained on Roland. Followed the word Adelaide sent. She figured you might run into trouble. Ruth stared at Roland, her mind reeling from the discovery about Finn, and felt something inside her shift from grief to cold fury. You killed my husband. Roland spat blood onto the floor. Wasn't me that drowned him. That was Crow's work at Tallow Creek Bend. Your precious Finn tried to play both sides, sell the ledger to Crow to keep him quiet, then sell copies to the railway inspector to line his pockets. Real enterprising, your Finn. He laughed a bitter sound. Crow found out about the double cross. Couldn't have that. So he had some boys hold Finn under the water until he stopped thrashing. I just watched. The words hit Ruth like physical blows. The cabin seemed to tilt around her. Finn hadn't been a hero trying to expose corruption. He'd been an opportunist trying to profit from it, and when he'd gotten too greedy, too careless, Crow had killed him. The man she'd mourned, the father of her child, had been a liar and a cheat. She sank onto the bench, the torn ledger page clenched in her fist. The baby kicked, as if reminding her it was there innocent of its father's sins. Ruth pressed her hand to her belly and felt tears sting her eyes, not grief anymore, but rage. Rage at Finn for his lies at Crow, for his cruelty at the whole rotten situation. Then we finish what he started. She said, her voice hard and steady despite the tears. But we do it right. For everyone Crow's hurt. Not for profit. For justice. Chayton looked at her, and in his eyes she saw understanding respect and something that might have been pride. You set the pace, he said quietly. Trusty Tom nodded approvingly. What about him? He jerked his chin toward Roland. Chayton knelt beside Roland, his knife in his hand, the blade catching the light. Roland's eyes widened, but Chayton only cut a strip from Roland's own coat. You're going to write down everything you just said, every detail, and you're going to sign it. If you do that, we'll let you walk out of here. Roland's eyes darted between them, calculating. You think Crow won't find me if I betray him? Crow's going to have bigger problems than you, Ruth said coldly. Write it, or we leave you here tied up for Crow to find. I wonder what he'll do when he realizes you let us get away. Roland paled. It took him 3 tries with his bound hands, but he wrote it all down on the back of an old wanted poster Trusty Tom found in the cabin. Finn's attempted double-cross Crow's order, the drowning at Tallow Creek Bend. He signed it with a shaking hand. They tied him to a support post in the cabin, left him a canteen of water barely within reach, and took his signed statement. As they rode away, Roland's shouts followed them, growing fainter. Crow will kill you all. You're dead, you hear me, dead. But his voice was already swallowed by the wind. They rode hard after that Trusty Tom, with them now his rifle and his knowledge of the back trails adding strength to their small group. But Ruth couldn't shake Roland's words. Finn had died for greed, not honor. She was carrying the child of a man who'd cared more about money than about her, than about the life they were supposed to build together. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. That night, they camped in a dry arroyo, the stars brilliant overhead. Ruth sat apart from the fire, staring at nothing. Chayton brought her coffee and sat beside her, not speaking at first. Finally, he said quietly, Your husband's choices aren't yours. They don't define you. How can you say that I married him? I believed in him. You believed in the man he showed you he was. That's not your fault. Chaitin's voice was firm. You're here because you chose to fight for what's right. That matters more than what he did. Ruth looked at him, at the steadiness in his dark eyes. You really believe that... I know it. He held her gaze. You could have walked away. Sold the ledger to the highest bidder, taken the money, disappeared. You chose to bring it to the law, to fight Crow, even though it's dangerous. You chose courage. That's who you are. It wasn't comfort, it was truth, clean and sharp. And somehow, that was exactly what Ruth needed. The stone in her stomach didn't disappear, but it became bearable. She nodded once, and Chaitin touched her shoulder briefly before returning to the fire. That night, Ruth slept better than she had in weeks. The next day brought news that changed everything. They'd reached the outskirts of Storm Creek when a rider appeared. Adelaide, her horse, lathered her face pale. They're looking for you everywhere, she gasped. Crows deputized half the town. 15 men, maybe more, all wearing tin badges. He's strung barbed wire, the new barbed wire ranchers were stringing since the mid-1870s across the fords. We expected that, Chaitin said. There's more. Adelaide's voice shook. They caught Owen Pike trying to sabotage one of the dam's supports. Beat him in the street in front of his wife and children. And they've arrested Dr. Whitlow. He'd been treating people sick from the mercury keeping records. They threw him in the Blackwater Falls jail. Crow's planning to hang him tomorrow morning. Ruth exchanged glances with Chaitin. We can't let that happen. Whitlow's testimony would corroborate everything in the ledger. Blackwater Falls is 15 miles east, Trusty Tom said, heavily guarded. Then we go tonight, Ruth said. We're running out of time anyway. Gruner arrives in 2 days. They rode through the afternoon, reaching Blackwater Falls as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The jail was a squat stone building at the edge of town, isolated. 2 deputies guarded the front door, rifles in their hands, looking bored. Chaitin studied the building from a distance, then nodded to himself. There's a window on the back side. Too small for a man, but... He looked at Ruth. I'm 8 months pregnant, not exactly small anymore, Ruth pointed out. Not you, me. He pointed to the window again. I can make it. You and Tom create a distraction at the front. They waited for full dark. Then Ruth walked around to the front of the jail, one hand pressed to her belly, the other to her back, her face twisted in apparent pain. Please, she called out, her voice high and frightened. I need help. My baby, something's wrong. The deputies exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. Ma'am, you need to see the doctor, not... Please. Ruth gasped, doubling over. She'd seen enough women in labor to make it convincing. It hurts. Please help me. The deputy came closer, concerned now. Behind him, his partner was distracted, looking at Ruth. Neither saw Chaitin slip through the shadows to the back of the building. Inside, Chaitin dropped from the window into the office with barely a sound. The first deputy, the one who'd stayed inside, was pouring coffee, his back turned. Chaitin moved like water, silent and fast, and got his arm around the man's throat, cutting off his air. The deputy struggled briefly, then went limp. Chaitin lowered him to the floor, took his keys, and unlocked the cells. Dr. Whitlow, a slight man with graying hair and anxious eyes, stumbled out. Thank heavens. They were going to... No time, Chaitin said. Out the back, now. Outside, the deputy who'd approached Ruth was reaching for her arm when Trusty Tom appeared from the shadows, his rifle barrel pressed to the man's back. Don't move. Don't shout. Just stand real still. The second deputy went for his gun. Chaitin appeared in the doorway, and fired a shot that blew the gun from the man's hand. The man yelped and clutched his fingers. "Run," Chayton said calmly. Both deputies ran. Ruth, Chayton, Tom, and Whitlow mounted their horses and rode hard into the darkness. A shout went up behind them. They'd been discovered. A shot rang out, and Ruth heard the window above them shatter glass raining down. Something hot stung her calf, and she gasped. Blood soaked through her stocking. "You're hit." Chayton pulled his horse alongside hers. "Just a graze from the glass. Keep moving." They didn't stop until they'd put 5 miles between them and the town, finally taking shelter in an abandoned grist mill. Chayton bound Ruth's calf with a strip torn from his own shirt, his hands gentle. The cut was shallow but painful. They huddled in the mill's upper floor, lying flat on the old boards, as search parties combed the roads below their lanterns, bobbing like fireflies. Ruth's leg throbbed, and she was shaking from cold, from fear, from exhaustion. They lay inches apart, the darkness pressing in. Chayton's hand moved to her shoulder, steadying her, his warmth anchoring her. "You're shaking," he whispered. "I'm scared," Ruth admitted. "I know." His hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers firm, keeping her from slipping on the slanted floor. "I'm here. I won't let you fall." Their eyes met in the darkness, barely visible. But Ruth could feel the intensity of his gaze. For a moment, the fear receded, replaced by something else, something warm and fierce and fragile. She wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she just pressed closer, taking comfort in his presence, and he didn't pull away. By dawn, the search had moved on. They slipped out of the mill and met with Owen Pike, who'd been released after his beating, his face bruised purple and yellow, one eye swollen shut. He brought more people, 6 homesteaders, whose wells had been poisoned, 2 miners who'd gotten sick working in Crow's operation, a young woman whose husband had died from mercury exposure. They were frightened, but determined. "A federal agent with a U.S. Deputy Marshal Gruner's due at Storm Creek tomorrow evening," Owen said. "If we can present the evidence at the dam public like with enough witnesses, Crow can't silence us all." "It's a risk," Trusty Tom said. "Crow will have every gun he can hire." "Then we need to be smart," Ruth said. "Not just guns. We need strategy." Chayton nodded slowly. "We hit the dam at dusk. Confusion works in our favor. And we need to force the diversion gates open, let the water flow free again. That's evidence in itself." They spent the day planning gathering black powder from a cache Owen's friends had stolen from a mine supply wagon, dangerous, unstable, but necessary. Chayton knew how to place charges to breach the gates without bringing down the whole dam structure. It was a risk, but it was the only way. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, they approached Storm Creek Dam. The dam rose against the evening sky like a scar across the land, a crude barrier of logs, packed earth and stone that choked the creek to barely a trickle. The diversion gates stood open, channeling what water remained toward Crow's sluices and mercury pans. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur-wet rock and something chemical that burned Ruth's throat. Wind whipped across the open ground, carrying dust and the electric promise of a storm building in the west. Ruth, Chayton, Dr. Whitlow, Owen, Trusty Tom, and the 6 allies approached from the dry wash south of the dam, moving quietly through the gathering dusk. They cut through the barbed wire the new barbed wire ranchers were stringing since the mid-1870s. Crow's men had strung across the approaches using pliers. Owen had brought the wire singing softly as it parted. Chayton worked quickly, placing the oilskin-wrapped charges of black powder at the base of the diversion gates, his hands steady despite the danger. The plan was precise breach, and the gates not destroy the dam itself. Let the creek run free again. Force Crow to answer for what he'd done. They'd just finished when the thunder of hooves announced Crow's arrival. 12 riders came hard from the direction of the mine. Roland among them despite his injuries, his face still bruised from their encounter in the cabin. At their head rode Kensington Crow himself, a big man, bearded and powerful, his eyes cold as creek stones. And beside him, Sheriff Crooked Miles, his tin badge glinting in the fading light. They reined up 50 yards from the dam guns drawn, forming a line. Crow's voice boomed across the space between them, hard and mocking. "You're trespassing on private property, and you're under arrest, all of you." Ruth stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She held up Finn's ledger, the pages fluttering in the wind. "This ledger proves you've been dumping mercury into the creek for 2 years, poisoning the water, killing livestock, making people sick." She pulled a vial from her pocket, creek water Whitlow had collected, dark and oily. "Dr. Whitlow can testify to the effects. The federal land agent is on his way. You're going to answer for every life you've destroyed." Crow threw back his head and laughed, the sound harsh. "Gruner, he's not coming, sweetheart. Got delayed by a washout 20 miles north." He pulled a telegram from his pocket, waving it like a flag. "There's no one to hear your accusations. No one to save you." Chayton moved to stand directly in front of Ruth. His rifle raised his body, a barrier between her and Crow's men. "Then you'll hear them. Every word." Sheriff Miles raised his pistol, his face flushed with drink or anger or both. "Drop your weapons, or by God, we'll drop you where you stand." Owen and the homesteaders raised their rifles in response, forming a ragged line. For a moment, everything hung in perfect, terrible balance. 2 groups of armed people 30 yards apart, fingers on triggers, the wind tugging at coats and hair. Then Crow pulled a match from his vest pocket. His grin was vicious as he struck it against his saddle, the small flame flaring bright. "You want a fight? I'll give you a fight." He tossed the match toward the dry grass near where Ruth and the others stood. The wind caught the flame. Fire raced across the ground with terrifying speed, the dry vegetation igniting like tinder. Smoke billowed up thick and choking. Chaos erupted in an instant. Owen fired first, his shot hitting one of Crow's men in the shoulder, spinning the man out of his saddle. Miles returned fire, the bullet sparking off a rock near Ruth's head, showering her with stone chips. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted. "Now!" Chayton yelled and touched the smoldering cord he'd prepared to the charges. The explosion was enormous, a roar that shook the ground. The diversion gates blew apart in a shower of splintered logs and twisted metal. Water surged through the breach instantly, a roaring wall of brown and white, freed after months of captivity. The force of it was staggering. The flood caught Crow as he was dismounting, knocked him off his feet, and swept him 10 yards downstream before he managed to grab hold of a boulder, coughing and cursing. Miles was thrown from his horse into the shallows, his gun flying from his hand. The fire hissed and died as water washed over it, sending up great clouds of steam. Men on both sides scrambled for higher ground as the water spread, reclaiming its old channel. In the confusion, Crow staggered to his feet, water streaming from his clothes, and spotted Ruth. His face twisted with rage. He pulled a pistol from his belt, but it must have been specially sealed because it still fired. He aimed directly at her. Chayton's rifle cracked. The bullet hit Crow in the shoulder, spinning him around, but the big man didn't go down. He lunged toward Ruth, water and mud flying from his boots, his good hand reaching for her throat. Chayton dropped the rifle and grabbed a length of chain that had been part of the gate mechanism, whipping it around. He swung it with all his strength, the chain catching Crow across the chest and driving him backward toward the water's edge. They grappled, Chayton younger and faster, Crow heavier and powered by fury. Ruth saw Roland raising his gun, aiming at Chayton's back. She grabbed a rock and threw it, hitting Roland's horse in the flank. The animal reared, and Roland's shot went wild. But as she watched, Roland's eyes met Crow's fallen form. then darted to the federal posse that impossibly was now appearing on the ridge above, drawn by the sound of the explosion. Roland's face went through a rapid calculation. He'd betrayed Crow once by talking in the cabin. Now he made his final choice. He wheeled his horse and fled at a gallop, abandoning his employer to save himself. Several of Crow's other men, seeing the fight was lost, followed him. Trusty Tom appeared from the smoke and chaos, his forge hammer in his hand. He brought it down on Crow's wrist with a sickening crack. Crow screamed, his hand shattering the pistol, falling into the mud. Miles tried to rise from where he'd fallen, but Owen's allies surrounded him, rifles leveled, and he subsided defeated. Through the smoke and the spray and the fading light, a rider appeared on the ridge, a federal agent with a U.S. Deputy Marshal Gruner, soaked and mud-spattered from fighting through the washout, his horse lathered. He must have heard the explosion from miles away. He dismounted and took in the scene with sharp eyes, the broken dam, the water running free. Ruth holding the ledger, Dr. Whitlow standing ready to testify, Crow bleeding and broken on the ground. Gruner's face hardened into a mask of official fury. Kensington Crow, by the authority of the United States government, you're under arrest for the poisoning of federal waterways, destruction of public resources, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 6 other charges I'll think of on the ride back. He gestured, and 2 deputies who'd come with him moved forward with manacles. Crow sagged, the fight going out of him all at once. Sheriff Miles found his badge torn from his vest by one of the angry homesteaders, the tin star thrown into the mud. The fight was over. The creek ran free again, the water clear and cold as it carved its old path through the land, washing away months of poison and neglect. By the next morning, people from Storm Creek were coming down to the banks with buckets, filling them without paying, without fear. Their faces were bright with relief and something like joy. Children waded in the shallows, laughing and splashing, the sound sweet after so much tension. Crow was taken to Grey Wolf, in chains his arm, in a sling his empire shattered. Roland vanished entirely. Word came later through Adelaide's connections that he'd taken a freight job east, under a false name, slipping away into anonymity, as men like him often did. Sheriff Miles was officially dismissed, his badge and authority stripped, his reputation in ruins. He left Storm Creek on foot, and no one saw him again. Owen Pike recovered slowly from his beating, though he lost the full use of 2 fingers on his right hand. The homesteaders who'd fought beside them received official commendation from Gruner, and more importantly, promises of compensation for their poisoned wells. Trusty Tom received donations from grateful townsfolk. To expand his forge, he'd become a local hero, the blacksmith who'd stood up to Crow. Dr. Whitlow threw himself into documenting the medical effects of the mercury poisoning, his careful notes, becoming part of the federal case against Crow and setting precedent for future environmental protections. He checked on Ruth daily, growing increasingly concerned. "The exertion you've been through," he told her on the 3rd day after the battle. "It may bring the baby early. You need to rest. Really rest." But rest was hard to come by. There were statements to give, testimonies to record, legal proceedings to navigate. Gruner was thorough, building an airtight case. The hearing and inquest, in effect with the record to be forwarded to the territorial court, was set for a week after the dam breach. The schoolhouse was packed the day of the hearing, an inquest in effect with the record to be forwarded to the territorial court, people standing 3 deep along the walls. Gruner presided, his manner crisp and official. He presented the evidence methodically, Finn's ledger with its damning columns of mercury purchases and dates. Dr. Whitlow's testimony about the illnesses he'd treated. The signed statement from Roland detailing Finn's murder. Water samples that showed mercury contamination. And the testimony of a dozen townspeople about their suffering. The ruling was swift and comprehensive. Public access to Storm Creek was permanently restored. Federal oversight of all mining operations using mercury within territorial boundaries was mandated. Kensington Crow's assets, including the mine, his land holdings, and his accounts, were seized to pay compensation to affected families. The amounts were specific. Each family with a poisoned well received $50 in immediate relief, plus reimbursement for new well digging. Owen Pike received $100 for his injuries. The families of those who died from mercury-related illnesses received $200 each. It was justice, real and tangible. Ruth sat in the back of the schoolhouse watching it unfold, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Finn's death. After the hearing and inquest in effect with the record to be forwarded to the territorial court, a man approached her as she stood outside in the afternoon sun. He was a merchant, respectable-looking middle-aged, with a well-kept suit and a calculating kindness in his eyes. "Mrs. Larkin," he said, removing his hat, "I'd like to make you an offer. A practical arrangement." Ruth waited wary. "Marriage," he said simply. "I'm a widower myself. I have a business, a house. I can give your child a name, provide for you both. In exchange, you'd keep my house, manage my domestic affairs. It would be mutually beneficial." It was a lifeline. It was also a cage, a transaction, a surrender of the independence she'd fought so hard to claim. Ruth looked past him to where Chayton stood by the horses, waiting quietly, his rifle slung over his shoulder. She looked at the creek, running free and clear. She thought of everything she'd survived, everything she'd become. "No," she said. The merchant blinked, clearly not having expected that answer. "No, I don't need a husband. I need land." Ruth's voice was firm, clear. "Thank you for the offer, but no." She walked past him to where Gruner was organizing his papers. "Mr. Gruner, I have a question about the Homestead Act." She filed her application at the land office and began the required period of residence and improvement. The patent would come later in due course. Gruner looked up, interested. "Go on." "Widows can file claims if they're heads of household, correct?" "They can indeed. There's an abandoned plot near the cottonwoods west of town. It was surveyed but never settled. I saw it marked on the map in Finn's ledger. Can I claim it?" Gruner pulled out his survey documents, cross-referencing them with the ledger. After a few minutes, he nodded. "The boundaries check out. It's unclaimed federal land. If you're willing to file and meet the settlement requirements living on it, making improvements, it's yours." He prepared the paperwork, and Ruth signed her name with a steady hand, each letter an act of defiance and hope. 3 days later, Ruth's labor began. It started with a dull ache in her back as she was helping Adelaide sort donated supplies at the schoolhouse. Within an hour, the contractions were coming fast and hard, too fast. Dr. Whitlow took one look at her and said, "We need to get you somewhere private, now." Chayton, who'd been standing watch outside, didn't hesitate. "The cave. It's close and it's sheltered." He helped her onto his horse, mounted behind her, and rode carefully but quickly to the original cave, where he'd first brought her high in the rocks. It felt like coming full circle. Chayton built up the fire heating water in a salvaged pot, his movements calm despite the urgency. Whitlow arrived within the hour, with Adelaide right behind him. The labor was hard. Ruth had known it would be, but knowing didn't make it easier. The pain came in waves, each one cresting higher than the last. She gripped Chayton's shoulder through the contractions, her nails digging into his skin, and he didn't flinch, only murmured steady reassurances. "You're strong. You can do this. Breathe. That's it." Whitlow coached her through it, Adelaide providing water and cool cloths for her forehead. The hours blurred together. At some point, night fell outside the cave, the stars emerging in the vast prairie sky. And then, just as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, the baby came. A girl. Small but healthy, with a cry that echoed off the cave walls, strong, defiant, alive. Whitlow cut the cord and handed the tiny bundle to Ruth, who was crying and laughing at once. She held her daughter close, feeling the warmth of the small body, the reality of this new life she'd brought into the world against all odds. Chayton touched the baby's head with one finger, his large hand impossibly gentle, his face transformed by something like wonder. "What will you call her?" His voice was rough with emotion. Ruth thought of the creek running free of the fight they'd won, of the future that was now possible. Hope. Her name is Hope. Chayton smiled, then a real smile that softened his whole face, and Ruth felt her heart turn over in her chest. The final surprise came a week later. Ruth was resting in Adelaide's spare room. The schoolteacher had insisted she stay there until she was strong enough to move when Trusty Tom came to visit. He had an odd expression somewhere between proud and sheepish. "Got something to show you," he said. He helped her walk out to a wagon, Hope bundled in a blanket that Adelaide had sewn. They drove to Ruth's claimed land, the plot near the cottonwoods where the creek ran close. And there, where before there had been only open ground, stood a cabin. It was small, just one room, but it was solid. Tight chinked logs, a sturdy roof, with real shingles, a stone hearth built to last, a door that hung straight and true. The window had real glass, and through it, Ruth could see that someone had already moved in her trunk and a few pieces of furniture, a bed frame, a table, 2 chairs. How? Ruth could barely speak. Trusty Tom grinned. Town took up a collection. Everybody contributed something. Gruner gave $20 himself. Even got a few anonymous donations. One was a postal order, probably from Roland, trying to square his conscience before he disappeared. He gestured to the cabin. "We figured you'd earned it. Chayton did most of the building. That man can work." Ruth looked for Chayton and found him standing near the creek, watching the water flow. She walked over to him slowly, Hope in her arms, and stood beside him. "You built this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Tom and the others helped," Chayton replied, not looking at her. "But you led it. You did it for me." He finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw everything he hadn't said during their desperate flight across the territory. The respect, the care, the feelings that had grown in the spaces between survival and hope. You needed a home, you and Hope both. You'd fought for it. You deserved it. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." He hesitated, then said carefully, "I can stay close if you want. Make sure you're safe. Help with the heavy work until you're established." It was an offer, but also a question. Ruth thought of everything they'd been through together, of the river crossing the cave, the battle at the dam, the 1,000 small moments of trust and protection, and something deeper than either of them had named. She thought of his hand on her back in the freezing water, his body shielding hers from bullets, his voice in the darkness saying, "I'm here." "You asked me to set the pace once," Ruth said quietly. "Back at the beginning." Chayton nodded. "I remember. I'm setting it now." She met his eyes, letting him see the truth in hers. "I want you to stay, not just close, here, with us, if that's what you want." For a long moment, Chayton didn't speak. Then he reached out and touched Hope's tiny hand, and the baby's fingers curled around his, gripping tight. When he looked back at Ruth, his eyes were bright. "I'll keep it," he said softly, echoing his words from that first night in the cave. But now they meant something different, something bigger. A promise of commitment, of partnership, of a future built together. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in words. But it was there in the cabin he'd built, in the way he looked at her and her daughter, in the choice he was making to stay, when he could have returned to his people. It was love, proven through action, through survival, through the hard work of choosing each other day after day. That night they sat by the hearth in the new cabin, the fire crackling warmly. Hope slept in a cradle Chayton had carved, her tiny breaths even and peaceful. Chayton spread the same buffalo fur he'd used in the cave near the hearth, settling onto it, with his back against the wall, his rifle within reach, out of habit. Ruth watched him from where she sat in the chair nursing her daughter, and felt something settle in her chest, something warm and solid and right. "You're going to sleep there. For now," Chayton said. "Until you tell me different." She smiled. The future was uncertain, as it always was in this hard land. There would be challenges ahead, building a life from nothing, navigating the complex realities of a Lakota man and a white woman, choosing to build a family together in a territory that didn't look kindly on such things. But they'd faced worse together. They'd survived. Outside, the creek ran free, the water clear and cold, washing away the poison of the past. The moon rose silver and steady, and the night was quiet except for the baby's soft breaths and the crackle of the fire and the murmur of the water over stones. Hope had been born in the wilderness, in danger and blood. But she would grow up in a home with a mother who'd fought for her and a man who'd stood beside them both when everyone else had turned away. Ruth looked at Chayton, at the steadiness in his face, and felt the seed that had been planted in fear and desperation bloom into something real and lasting. The blanket Chayton had pulled back that first night in the cave, offering shelter when she'd had none, now covered the cradle where her daughter slept. It was just a piece of wool, simple and practical. But it was also a symbol of protection, of trust, of promises kept, and futures earned. Ruth set Hope back in the cradle and moved to sit beside Chayton on the fur. He shifted to make room, and when she leaned against his shoulder, his arm came around her, steady and sure. They sat like that as the fire burned low, neither needing words, watching the small miracle of the child they would raise together in the home they would build with their own hands. The creek murmured outside, a constant song of freedom and renewal. The stars wheeled overhead. And for the first time since Finn had died, Ruth felt not just hope, but peace. The story of Storm Creek was over. The story of their life together was just beginning.